Picture this. You're a Roman citizen. It's 79 AD. You just finished your business at the public latrine, and now it's time to clean up. Except there's no toilet paper. There's no napkin. Instead, there's a stick with a sponge on the end. And here's the kicker. That sponge is not yours. It belongs to everyone, the entire bathhouse. Every single person who sat on that stone bench before you used the exact same sponge on a stick, dunked it in a shared bucket of vinegar water, and passed it along like some kind of horrifying hygiene relay race. Welcome to the wild, itchy, occasionally parasite-riddled history of how humans wiped their butts before toilet paper existed. And spoiler alert, leaves were actually one of the more pleasant options. So why did ancient humans wipe with leaves? The short answer is because they were everywhere, they were free. And compared to some of the alternatives, they were basically a luxury spa treatment. But the long answer, the one that involves corn cobs, mussel shells, frozen tundra moss, and a Roman emperor who allegedly used lettuce, that's a story worth sticking around for. Because by the end of this, you're never going to look at a tree the same way again. Let's start with the obvious question. Before plumbing, before paper, before literally any of the infrastructure we take for granted, how did our ancestors handle the most universal human problem there is? Because here's the thing. No matter what era you were born into, no matter what continent, no matter how advanced or primitive your society was, everybody had to deal with the same biological reality. Kings had to deal with it. Peasants had to deal with it. And nature, in its infinite chaotic wisdom, did not hand out a universal solution. Every culture had to figure it out on their own, using whatever was lying around. And what was usually lying around? Plants, leaves, grass. That's why leaves show up again and again across totally unconnected civilizations, from the forests of ancient Europe to the jungles of Southeast Asia to the plains of pre-colonial North America. It wasn't some shared cultural tradition passed down through trade routes. It was convergent evolution of bathroom habits. When your two options are use the abundant, soft, biodegradable material growing at knee height, or use a rock, most people are going to pick the leaf. Every single time. But not just any leaf. This is where it gets interesting, because ancient humans were not just blindly grabbing whatever green thing was closest. There was actual hard-won knowledge involved, trial and error, probably a lot of very unfortunate error. Certain plants became known specifically for their bathroom-appropriate qualities, and this knowledge got passed down for generations because getting it wrong was, quite literally, a pain. Take mullein, for example. If you've never heard of it, mullein is a tall, fuzzy-leaved plant that grows wild across Europe, Asia, and eventually North America once it hitched a ride with colonizers. Its leaves are big, soft, and almost velvety to the touch. Pioneers in America actually nicknamed it cowboy toilet paper, and it earned that title honestly. It's soft enough to be gentle, it's large enough to actually do the job, and it doesn't have any nasty surprises like thorns or irritating sap. It was basically nature's two-ply. Compare that to, say, poison ivy, which, fun fact, absolutely was not used intentionally, but you can bet there were people throughout history who learned the hard way what happens when you grab the wrong leaf in the dark in the woods in a hurry. And if you think that's rough, consider that poison ivy's cousin, poison oak, grows in the same regions as some of these safe broadleaf plants people relied on. So there was a real skill, a real botanical literacy that ancient and pre-modern people needed just to survive their own bathroom breaks without ending up in agony for a week. Imagine having to teach your kids not just don't touch that plant, but don't touch that plant with the part of your body you least want touched. This wasn't trivial knowledge. In hunter-gatherer societies, elders would pass down which plants were safe, which were dangerous, which worked best in which season. This was survival information on par with knowing which berries wouldn't kill you. Because in a world without modern medicine, a bad reaction in a very sensitive area wasn't just uncomfortable, it could get infected. And infections in the pre-antibiotic era could be lethal. So when we talk about ancient humans wiping with leaves, we're not talking about some quaint, simple little habit. We're talking about generations of accumulated botanical wisdom, refined through what was probably an enormous amount of suffering. Now let's take a little detour, because leaves weren't the only plant-based option on the table, and understanding the alternatives really puts into perspective just how good leaves actually had it. In many parts of the world, especially in drier regions or seasons when broad-leafy plants weren't available, people turned to other materials. Grass was common. You'd bundle it up, and it worked in a pinch, though it wasn't exactly known for being gentle. Moss was a favorite in cooler, wetter climates, especially in parts of northern Europe, because it's naturally soft, incredibly absorbent, and this is the part that surprises people, moss has mild natural antiseptic properties. Some species of sphagnum moss were even used for wound dressing because of their absorbency and antibacterial qualities, which meant using it for personal hygiene wasn't just convenient, it may have actually reduced infections compared to rougher materials. Basically, ancient humans stumbled onto a natural product that modern wound care researchers would later validate scientifically. Not bad for people who didn't have Google. Then there's corn cobs. In the Americas, once corn cultivation became widespread, dried corn cobs became an extremely common wiping tool, and this practice actually persisted for centuries, all the way into rural America in the 1800s and even into the early 1900s in some remote areas, right up until mass-produced toilet paper became affordable and widely available. If you've ever seen the classic image of an outhouse with a little basket of corn cobs next to it, that's not folklore. That's just what people did. And yes, before you ask, they typically used the softer, drier cobs rather than the fresh, juicy ones, because nobody was trying to make the experience worse than it needed to be. And then there's the option that really puts things into perspective: shells and stones. In some coastal and desert regions where soft, leafy plants simply weren't available, people used mussel shells, smooth stones, or pieces of clay pottery, literally called pessoi in ancient Greece, which is a Greek word essentially meaning the pottery shards you use to clean yourself. Archaeologists have actually found ceramic pessoi in ancient latrines, some of them inscribed with the names of political enemies because apparently ancient Greeks thought there was no better way to insult someone than to metaphorically wipe your butt with their name. Political satire has never been more literal, so when you put it all in context, moss, corn cobs, grass, broken pottery, communal sponges on sticks, leaves start to look downright civilized. Soft, plentiful, disposable, and generally not going to give you a rash or an infection if you picked the right species. It's honestly kind of beautiful in a weird way. Nature basically pre-packaged the solution, and humans just had to learn which wrapper to grab. Now let's zoom into specific civilizations because the why behind leaf usage actually shifts depending on where and when you're looking. In ancient China, before the invention of paper, which, fun fact, China also invented, and which eventually became the material of choice for hygiene purposes among the wealthy, people commonly used bamboo or wooden sticks called chugi, especially in Japan, which was heavily influenced by Chinese sanitation practices. These sticks had a curved, flattened end specifically designed for scraping rather than absorbing, kind of like a built-in tool rather than a disposable one. But before wood and before paper, broad leaves were absolutely a fallback, particularly for common people who didn't have access to specially crafted tools or later expensive paper. Paper, once invented in China around the 2nd century BC, was actually a luxury item for a very long time, and using it for hygiene was initially considered wasteful, even disrespectful, since paper was associated with writing and scholarship. So while the elite eventually moved toward paper, the average farmer was still very much in leaf and stick territory for a long, long time. Meanwhile, over in ancient Rome, we already talked about the infamous shared sponge on a stick, called a tersorium. But leaves weren't totally absent from Roman hygiene either. Wealthier Romans had access to wool soaked in rosewater as a fancier option, but poorer citizens and rural populations relied heavily on foliage, grass, and even smooth stones when nothing better was around. And here's a wild detail. Some historical accounts suggest that certain unpopular Roman figures were mocked in writing for their crude bathroom habits, including using rough materials that today we'd consider borderline torturous. Rome had a whole hierarchy of hygiene, and where you stood socially often determined literally what you were wiping with. Now let's talk about the Islamic world, because this is genuinely one of the most interesting threads in this whole story. In many Islamic cultures historically and to this day, the preferred method of cleaning after using the bathroom is actually water, not paper or leaves at all, a practice called istinja. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. This is tied to specific religious guidelines about cleanliness found in Islamic teachings, and it's part of why, even now, many bathrooms across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia include a small handheld bidet sprayer instead of relying solely on toilet paper. But before running water and plumbing existed, this same principle was applied using natural materials like smooth stones combined with water, and yes, in certain regions and time periods, leaves were absolutely part of that toolkit as a supplementary cleaning material, especially in more rural or resource-limited settings where water access might be inconsistent. Now let's hop over to the Americas, before European colonization. Indigenous peoples across North and South America used an incredibly wide variety of natural materials depending entirely on their local environment. Because when you don't have global trade routes shipping you toilet paper from a factory somewhere, you use what your ecosystem gives you. In desert regions, that might mean smooth stones, or specific desert plants. In forested regions, broadleaf plants were common, and certain tribes specifically cultivated knowledge of which leaves were softest and safest. In colder northern regions, including among Inuit and other Arctic peoples, snow itself was sometimes used, which sounds absolutely brutal, but in freezing climates, snow is clean, plentiful, and honestly kind of numbing, which some historical accounts suggest wasn't entirely unwelcome. Moss and tundra grass were also common in these regions during warmer months when snow wasn't available. Basically, wherever humans went, they adapted, and leaves were one of the most consistent, most universal solutions precisely because leafy plants are one of the most widespread resources on planet Earth. It's kind of poetic when you think about it. Different continents, different centuries, completely disconnected societies, and yet they independently arrived at the same basic answer: grab a leaf. So now let's get into the actual science of why leaves work so well for this purpose, because there's real biology and botany behind why some leaves became the go-to choice while others were avoided like the plague. Sometimes literally. The ideal wiping leaf needed a few key qualities. First, softness and pliability. Nobody wants a stiff, waxy, or leathery leaf. That's why broad, soft-leaved plants like mullein, certain dock leaves, and large maple or grape leaves were favorites in various regions. Second, size. Bigger leaves obviously covered more area and required fewer, applications. Third, and this is crucial, non-toxicity and non-irritation. This ruled out anything with sap, thorns, fine hairs that could cause irritation, or oils like the notorious urushiol found in poison ivy and poison oak. And fourth, durability without being tough. You wanted something that wouldn't just disintegrate or tear apart the moment it made contact, but also wasn't so fibrous that it felt like sandpaper. Interestingly, some of these plants had additional properties that made them doubly useful. Dock leaves, for example, which grow wild across Europe and were commonly used in ancient and medieval times, contain natural compounds that can actually soothe skin irritation, which is somewhat ironic and also very convenient because dock leaves famously grow right next to stinging nettles in the wild, almost like nature paired them together, as a built-in problem and solution combo. Generations of children in Britain have been taught to rub a dock leaf on a nettle sting, and honestly, if it works for stings, it makes sense it was also gentle enough for more sensitive uses. Now here's a detail that really surprises people. Using the wrong leaf wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be genuinely dangerous. And there's actual historical and even modern evidence of this. There are documented cases, even in relatively recent history, of people in wilderness or emergency situations grabbing an unfamiliar leaf without realizing it was poison ivy, poison oak, or poison sumac, resulting in severe allergic reactions in an area of the body where you really, really do not want a severe allergic reaction. Wilderness survival guides to this day include specific warnings about this exact scenario, which tells you that even with all our modern knowledge, this ancient problem hasn't fully gone away. So next time you're out camping and you're tempted to improvise, maybe just pack some actual toilet paper. Ancient humans would probably tell you to learn from their mistakes. Let's also talk about hygiene and health more broadly, because this is where the story gets a little less funny and a little more fascinating from a public health perspective. Before modern sanitation, hygiene practices, including how people cleaned themselves after using the bathroom, played a significant role in the spread or prevention of disease. That shared Roman sponge we mentioned earlier, historians and public health researchers have pointed out that communal cleaning tools like that likely contributed to the spread of intestinal parasites and infections throughout Roman society. Meanwhile, individual disposable options like leaves, used once and then discarded, were actually in some ways more hygienic than reusable communal tools, simply because there was no cross-contamination between users. It's a strange twist. The primitive leaf might have actually been safer than the more developed Roman sponge system in certain respects. This is part of why, when you look at the sweep of history, you see this back and forth where more advanced civilizations sometimes had worse hygiene outcomes than simpler societies purely because of how communal or individual their practices were. It's a great reminder that more advanced doesn't automatically mean healthier, and that sometimes the humble, disposable leaf was quietly doing a better job than an elaborate shared bathroom tool that people thought was fancy. Now, let's fast forward a bit and talk about the slow, gradual death of leaf wiping as toilet paper started to take over. Because this transition took a lot longer than most people realize, and it happened at wildly different speeds around the world. Paper, as we mentioned, was invented in China, and by around the 6th century AD, there are actual historical records of paper being used specifically for hygiene purposes among Chinese officials and the wealthy. This is genuinely one of the earliest documented uses of paper for this purpose anywhere in the world. But it took over 1,000 years for anything resembling mass-produced, widely accessible toilet paper to reach the general population, even in China. In the Western world, it took even longer. Commercial toilet paper as we'd recognize it wasn't introduced until 1857 when an American named Joseph Gaiety started selling packaged sheets of paper specifically marketed for hygiene use. And get this, before that, in America, people were using pages torn out of newspapers, and later, the Sears catalog became a genuinely popular bathroom item, not for reading, but specifically because its thin pages were perfect for the job. Once Sears switched to glossy paper in the 1930s, there were actual documented complaints from customers upset that they'd lost their favorite bathroom tool. That's a real historical footnote. People were mad about losing their toilet paper catalog. So even after paper became available, plenty of people, especially in rural areas, especially those without much money, kept using corn cobs, leaves, and other natural materials well into the 20th century. This wasn't some ancient practice confined to the distant past. There are people alive today whose grandparents or even parents grew up using leaves or corn cobs because toilet paper simply wasn't affordable or available where they lived. And honestly, that's what makes this whole topic so compelling. It's easy to think of ancient humans as some distant, disconnected category of people from a totally different world than ours. But the leaf wiping story connects directly to living memory in many parts of the world. It's not ancient history, it's family history for a lot of people. There's also a modern epilogue to this story that's worth mentioning, because it turns out humans might be coming full circle. In recent years, there's been a growing environmental movement questioning the sustainability of mass-produced toilet paper, given the sheer number of trees cut down every year specifically for this purpose. Estimates suggest tens of millions of trees globally. This has led to renewed interest in alternatives like bidets, which dominate in places like Japan and much of the Islamic world, and even a small but genuine resurgence of interest in sustainable, plant-based, biodegradable wiping materials in eco-conscious and survivalist communities. So, in a strange way, the ancient leaf wiping method, sustainable, biodegradable, zero manufacturing footprint, might actually represent the more environmentally sound approach, even if modern society is, understandably, not exactly rushing to switch back. So why did ancient humans wipe with leaves? Because leaves were abundant, adaptable, and when chosen correctly, genuinely effective. Because human ingenuity has always found a way to solve even the most unglamorous problems using whatever nature provided. Because across completely disconnected cultures spanning every inhabited continent, from Roman bathhouses to Arctic tundra to American frontier outhouses, people independently arrived at strikingly similar solutions using strikingly similar logic. And because, when you really think about it, the humble leaf represents something kind of profound about human history. The same species that would eventually build rockets and computers and skyscrapers started out its relationship with sanitation using the exact same tools available to every other creature in the forest. It's easy to laugh at this stuff, and honestly, you should. There's something genuinely funny about imagining a Roman senator dunking a communal sponge in vinegar water, or a colonial farmer teaching his kids the difference between a safe leaf and a poison ivy leaf through what was probably a very painful lesson. But underneath the humor, there's a real thread of resourcefulness, observation, and hard earned knowledge that got passed down for thousands of years, long before anyone thought to write it down in a history book. Next time you reach for a roll of toilet paper without a second thought, take a moment to appreciate just how recent and honestly how lucky that convenience really is. Somewhere out there, an ancient ancestor of yours once had to make a split-second judgment call about a leaf, get it right, and live to pass that knowledge down the line. All the way to you, sitting here, comfortable, dry, and blissfully leaf-free.